Welcome to the Horror Vault channel. We bring you the most unbelievable stories that will leave you wide-eyed wanting more. Subscribe now and hit the like button to join in the fun. But remember, once you've signed up, there's no turning back.
At school, I had a couple of close friends, Mark and Alex. We did many things together, and when it was time to graduate, Mark had to move away to Lexington, South Carolina, with his family due to his father's work. After we graduated and he completed the move with his family, my friend Alex and I were invited to visit his new house for a weekend. Out of boredom, we decided to go hiking in the nearby forest and countryside, where we discovered a scenic river. It was a beautiful area and felt peaceful, but we ended up getting lost. We decided to follow the river as we had lost track of whether we were going upstream or downstream. With no sounds of civilization within earshot, we quickly became concerned about finding a phone to call Mark's mom or dad for help, although there was no tarmac or road nearby that we could find. Continuing along the river, we came across an old church-like building made of weathered red bricks, with a dirt car park and a dirt road leading up to it. The place was heavily overgrown with vegetation and bushes. We decided to venture inside the building, hoping to find someone we could ask for help and perhaps use their phone to get the address of our current location. To our surprise, we noticed several old cars in the dirt car park. Covered in dirt and rust, these vehicles appeared to be from the 70s or 80s, possibly Novas. Most of them had flat or missing tires and were all painted white, or at least they used to be. The cars were lined up side by side. As we approached, we could hear the sounds of gospel music and singing coming from inside the church. Relieved to see that people were present, we entered the church, which appeared to be quite old and in a state of disrepair. Curiosity got the better of us, and we peered cautiously through the main doors into the hall, where we were greeted by the sight of about 24 people. Despite their obvious poverty, they had made an effort to dress as neatly as possible. As we ventured inside, the elderly woman with white hair and horn-rimmed glasses who had been playing the church piano suddenly stopped. She looked at us, her expression devoid of any emotion. As our presence became apparent, a strange thing happened. The entire congregation stopped singing, put down their psalm sheets, and slowly turned their eyes towards us. Their blank and unwelcoming stares pierced us. Mark, trying to break the uneasy silence, mustered an excuse, "Sorry to interrupt. We just need to use your phone to contact my parents for help." But not a word escaped the lips of anyone present. A suffocating silence engulfed the church, broken only by the faint creaking of the wooden pews under the weight of the congregation. Overwhelmed by an ominous fear, we retreated with slow, deliberate steps, allowing the door to close behind us. Exchanging uneasy glances, we left the building in silent trepidation. We set off, walking briskly along the dirt road. Alex pointed out the absence of any religious symbols or crosses inside the church, which struck us as odd. Looking back up the road, we noticed a group of about a dozen men emerge from the church and fix their gaze on us. The intensity of their gaze sent shivers down our spines. Overwhelmed with fear, we broke into a sprint, our legs propelling us forward for what seemed like an eternity as we raced along the dirt road, desperately trying to put as much distance as possible between us and the ghostly figures behind us. We finally arrived at a dilapidated petrol station, reminiscent of the old full-service stations of yesteryear. Stepping inside, we immediately noticed the mostly empty and dusty shelves, revealing a sense of neglect. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, his overly tanned skin contrasting with the oily and dirty baseball cap that adorned his head. Buried in an ancient book with ragged edges and yellowed pages, he glanced up to acknowledge our presence. "You're lost, huh?" he remarked. He went on to give us directions. Go back the way you came and turn left. Follow that road until you see a telephone pole. Turn right at the pole and follow the path that will lead you to a highway. We thanked him and left the petrol station in a hurry. As we made our way towards the telephone pole, we couldn't resist taking a look behind us. To our astonishment, the old man had positioned himself in front of the petrol station, his arms crossed and a disturbing toothy grin on his face. We reached the telephone pole, turned right and followed the path to the nearest motorway. By this time, dusk had set in and darkness was descending upon us. When we tried to flag down passing vehicles for help, we were met with indifference as no one stopped to offer assistance. Thankfully, a police officer saw us and pulled over to help us. We told him we were lost and gave him Mark's address, to which he whistled and said that we really were lost. It took about 30 minutes for that officer to drive us back to Mark's, and during the chit-chat, he told us we needed to be careful out in those woods, as there are some crazy rich folks in it. To say that we were shocked would be an understatement. Well, we promised ourselves not to hang around here again. Many years ago, when I was about 19, I and two of my friends, Jacob and Samuel, embarked on a foolish and terrifying adventure. Back then, engaging in reckless activities was our way of passing the time. Although Jacob is no longer a part of our lives, but Samuel and I still remember that scary story. We were living in New Jersey, a town full of empty houses, and on a hilly road not far from our homes stood an abandoned church. The locals were well aware of its existence, as it had been abandoned for countless years, and the road was permanently blocked off. Now living in Florida, I can't say for sure if the church is still standing and in what condition it is. Anyway, back then, Jacob, Samuel, and I, being the thrill-seeking troublemakers that we were, came up with a brilliant plan to bring a Ouija board to the church one late night. It was October, so we thought it would be a fitting tribute to the spooky season. Samuel happened to have a Ouija board tucked away in his closet, so he brought it with him. I drove the three of us, first picking up Jacob and then Samuel as we headed straight for the church. Since the road leading up the hill to the church was blocked off, we had to park on the side and continue on foot. Following the road up the hill, we cautiously used a single flashlight at first, so as not to attract any unwanted attention. However, once we reached the top of the hill, all three of us switched on our flashlights. The church stood amidst surrounding woods in every direction, with a gravel parking lot beside it. The place had been broken into numerous times before and was covered in graffiti, so the massive front door was already slightly ajar. It took the combined effort of two of us to pry it open as it scraped against the floor. However, once inside, we instinctively scanned the area with our flashlights, ensuring that no one else was present. The eerie feeling of being in that place at night sent shivers down our spines. Samuel proceeded to set up the Ouija board, and from his backpack, he produced 3 candles, chuckling as he said it would enhance the experience. He arranged the candles in a triangular formation around the board, and once they were all lit, we turned off our flashlights. The only illumination in the entire church emanated from those candles, creating an even more unsettling and uncomfortable ambience. We could hardly see beyond a 6-foot radius in any direction. Thus, we commenced our session with the Ouija board. Samuel took charge of most of the questioning. While I cannot recall his exact words, he definitely began with the cliched and customary question, "Is anybody there?" The planchette started to move, and we laughed, assuming it was one of us playing a prank. I believe it's impossible to use a Ouija board with friends without someone teasingly maneuvering the planchette. Nevertheless, we went along with it, and the person controlling it spelled out a few words. However, as this occurred, we heard a peculiar cracking sound emanate from the church's altar. The best way to describe it would be as if a large piece of wood had split in half. The sound was deafening and undeniably human in origin. All three of us jumped in response, hastily shining our cell phone flashlights in the direction of the altar. To our dismay, no one was there, at least as far as our limited vision allowed. I believe both Samuel and Jacob were as frightened as I was at that moment. However, since the church was dilapidated and falling apart, strange noises here and there didn't seem entirely implausible, so we decided to keep playing with the Ouija board. We took turns asking questions, but the planchette stopped moving. That cracking sound had startled all three of us and made us take the session more seriously. Time passed, and just as silence set in, another sound came from the altar area. Before we could even turn our lights on it, an object landed on the Ouija board, causing us all to scream and jump. It was a rock about the size of a golf ball. We had all had our hands on the planchette just 2 seconds before. There was no way any of us could have thrown the stone. In a state of panic, we ran out of the church, leaving the Ouija board and candles behind. We sprinted down the hill, fear driving us, consumed by the belief that someone or something was following us. Without hesitation, I drove us back to Jacob's house, where we sat in the car for a good half hour, discussing and trying to make sense of the unfathomable events that had unfolded before our eyes. Samuel, who is deeply religious and superstitious, was convinced that we had encountered some kind of spirit. Personally, I don't subscribe to such beliefs. I think there was another person in the church with us, which I find equally frightening. The next day, Samuel and Jacob returned to the church to retrieve the Ouija board, and to their dismay, the board was missing, while the candles remained in their original positions. Alarmed by this discovery, they quickly left without further investigation. To this day, it remains the most frightening experience of my life. I was about 6 years old when I first encountered red lights. Although my memories of that age are hazy, the intensity of my emotions when I saw those lights has left an indelible mark in my mind. One night, I abruptly woke up with a desperate need to relieve myself. As I squatted on the bed, preparing to make my way to the bathroom, I caught sight of two ominous red lights piercing through the darkness of the nursery. The room was engulfed in such darkness that I couldn't discern any specific details, but I immediately sensed the presence of a monstrous entity beside me, with those red lights serving as its eyes. Overwhelmed by fear, I couldn't even muster a scream. Instead, I instinctively sought refuge under the covers, trembling uncontrollably for what felt like an eternity until I eventually lost consciousness. I know what you're thinking, that it was all just a half dream and a childish fantasy. But I vividly remember what happened the next morning. The living room was in disarray. Someone had overturned all the chairs, poured water over the brand new color TV, and tossed the remote control out of the window. They had also toppled the icon in the hallway and painted a mocking mustache and goatee on it. I confided in my parents about the red lights haunting my room. They listened attentively, but as a naive young child, I remained oblivious to their thoughts and opinions. The haunting presence of the monster resurfaced when I reached the age of 14, like a recurring childhood nightmare. Once again, the darkness of the night surrounded me as I awoke with an urgent need to go to the bathroom, only to find those red, wrathful eyes staring at me from up close. They seemed even brighter than before. However, this time, with the advantage of age, I reacted differently. Despite the instant cold sweat that covered me, I swiftly made my way to the light switch, flicking it on and scouring the room with wide, panicked eyes. There was no sign of anyone. Determined to ease my growing unease, I meticulously searched through every room, including my parents' bedroom and my little brother's room, but silence enveloped the entire house. Returning to bed, I left the comforting glow of the light on, hoping it would chase away the haunting images of my childhood. Yet, those memories persisted, lingering in my mind and keeping me awake. The next morning, to my dismay, my brother was nowhere to be found. There were no open windows, no ajar doors. Our apartment was situated on the 6th floor, leaving no plausible explanation for his disappearance. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. In response to the mysterious situation, the police arrived at our home. Detectives meticulously questioned us, and I recounted my sighting to them, detailing the events exactly as they had unfolded. One of the detectives maintained a composed demeanor, attentively listening and asking a few clarifying questions. However, it was evident that they harbored skepticism. They seemed to attribute my recollection to emotional distress, suspecting that I had concocted the story. Johnny was never found. This time, my parents believed me. We decided to leave that cursed apartment behind and relocated to the other side of town, far away from the haunting memories. The year following my brother's disappearance was a nightmarish period, but gradually, my parents and I managed to recover from the devastating blow and slowly return to a semblance of a normal life. I completed my schooling, enrolled in university, found a girlfriend, and even secured a night job. However, I could never shake off the memory of those haunting red lights. I still lived in fear of their unknown owner, dreading the possibility that sooner or later they would find our new home. One winter Saturday night, when I was 22 years old, the haunting red lights returned. My girlfriend had spent the night, and we had both enjoyed a few beers before going to bed. Waking up with a dry mouth, I carefully got up and ventured out into the hallway. A jolt of fear almost escaped as I laid eyes on the red lights, moving ominously in the darkness of the corridor. They burned even brighter than before, resembling two blazing fires. The monster had found its way back into our apartment. It had tracked us down. In that moment, I couldn't afford to take any chances. I swiftly woke up Linda, urgently informing her that she needed to return home immediately. I called a taxi, guided the bewildered girl into the car, and ensured her safe departure. Then, I returned to the apartment and awakened my parents, recounting the harrowing events that had unfolded. We gathered in the kitchen, consumed by fear, and spent the entire night drinking tea and too terrified to venture elsewhere. Only as dawn broke on the following Sunday, relieved that nobody had pressing obligations, did we disperse to our respective bedrooms. I awoke well past midday, only to find an eerie stillness enveloping the apartment. The usual sounds of activity were absent. Having dinner alone with yesterday's soup, I grew increasingly concerned, as my parents had yet to rise from their slumber. Filled with worry, I ventured into their room to investigate. There was no father or mother in the bedroom. They were gone. They went after Johnny. The red lights took them. I didn't call the police. I knew they wouldn't find them. Besides, it would only make things worse, because they would suspect me. I sat at the table, drank the whiskey I had bought from a kiosk, and cried uncontrollably, not knowing what to do. And then, I blacked out. When I woke up, it was almost midnight. The apartment was shrouded in darkness, making it impossible to see. Stumbling down the corridor, I saw the red lights again. But this time they didn't frighten me, they enraged me. I begged the flames, my voice filled with a mixture of desperation and anger.
Bring back my parents! Bring back my little brother! Make everything the way it was!
As I approached, Drawn to the possessor of those bloodshot eyes, I accidentally collided with a large mirror, the impact sending a jolt of pain through my forehead. In front of me, the red lights remained suspended in midair, emitting an unsettling glow. Memories flickered in my mind. Of course, in my old flat there was a large mirror in my bedroom, and when I woke up, I could always see my reflection in it. In the new flat there was no mirror in the bedroom, it hung in the hallway instead. When I was 6 years old, on an evening when I wanted to watch cartoons on the television, my father had a different idea. He claimed my chair and the remote and sat down to watch action films instead. Feeling a mixture of anger and deep hurt, I retreated to bed. That night, the TV, chair, and remote all suffered the consequences of my frustration. At the tender age of 6, I couldn't really identify the culprits behind my suffering. When I was 14, during dinner, I playfully slapped Johnny's arm, expecting a harmless joke. To my surprise, he began to cry, as if I had hit him with a stick. In response, my father abruptly slapped me on the back of the head, while my mother stood by his side. I rubbed my head and glanced at my younger brother, before retreating to my room in silence. I strangled Johnny. Then I put the tiny body in my big duffel bag, took the keys, opened the door, went downstairs, and threw my brother and the bag into the raging river not far from our house. Yesterday, I found myself in my parents' room and quietly told them that I wanted to marry Linda. My parents were surprised and worried. They questioned whether Linda, who they believed had a difficult family situation, was the right choice for me. They shared their concerns and, although it was difficult, I listened carefully. However, I reached my breaking point and could no longer take it. I swallowed my anger and returned to my room, where Linda was waiting patiently. I managed a strained smile and took a sip from my beer bottle. In the morning, I went into my father's and mother's bedroom, stabbed them to death, and then moved the bodies into the bathroom. I spent a lot of time taking the bodies out and changing the sheets. But I did my job. I blinked slowly as I stood in front of the mirror, causing the red lights to fade for a moment. But as soon as I opened my eyes again, they flashed with even greater intensity. At that moment, thoughts of Linda consumed my mind. She knew I was in the flat last night. If it hadn't been for her, I would have been able to prove that I had slept elsewhere. There were good friends who wouldn't have betrayed me under any circumstances. But Linda, no, I couldn't have trusted her with something like that. And she was an orphan. She had no close friends. If she disappeared, no one could have linked her disappearance to me. Without moving from the mirror, I took my mobile out of my pocket and dialed the girl's number. Hi, Linda. Listen, why don't I pick you up? Yeah, I know it's a bit late, but my parents are at the country house. We can party all night, just you and me. In the morning, I would forget everything. Just as usual. But the red lights in the mirror were getting bigger. They were smiling at me. Randall Jensen got up very early today. It was his first day at school. The 5-year-old put on the clothes that had been laid out for him and ran down the stairs. He quickly made himself a bowl of cereal and ate it down. Then, he started playing with his toy truck to pass the time while his mother slowly woke up and got ready for her day. While playing with the truck, a figure appeared in front of Randall. The figure was adult size, slightly translucent, and looked like a clown. It had a very silly smile on its face, which seemed to be fixed. Its eyes were fixed on Randall and didn't move. Suddenly, the clown leaned over to the boy and shouted his name several times, "Randall, Randall, Randall." Randall tried to look away from the clown. He ignored the clown's request and continued to play with his truck. Then, the clown knocked a glass statue off a nearby coffee table. The statue shattered into dozens of pieces on the wooden floor. Upset, Randall whined and asked why the clown would do such a thing. The clown replied by urging him to have fun and reminding him that one cannot be good all the time. Randall's mother, alerted by the noise, rushed downstairs to investigate. When she saw the shattered glass and debris, her face contorted in anger. Randall tried to explain that it was the clown who caused the destruction, but his mother dismissed his claims and admonished him for lying on his first day of school. She told him to get his things together so she could take him to school and warned him that his lying had to stop. At school, Randall found himself seated at a small desk, third from the front in the middle row of the classroom. As the first hour of the day passed, he struggled to concentrate on the teacher, his mind constantly wandering back to the morning's encounter with the clown and the broken statue. Gradually, he began to feel more comfortable and relaxed. It was during this time that the clown made his second appearance. There was a girl sitting in front of Randall, and the clown began to mock the boy, insinuating that the girl was bad, that she stank, and that such people should be got rid of. Randall remained silent, trying to stay calm and not react to the clown. Despite his best efforts, Randall's fear grew. Suddenly, the clown punched the girl in the back of the head, causing her to scream in pain. The teacher, alarmed by the commotion, raised her voice and demanded an explanation. Through tears, the girl accused Randall of hitting her. Little Randall cried and, for the umpteenth time that day, tried to explain that it wasn't his fault, but the mischief of a strange clown. Furious, the teacher glared at Randall and shouted that there was only one clown in the room, and that was Randall himself. The whole class burst out laughing at the accusation. In an attempt to restore order, the teacher banged a ruler on her desk and demanded silence. She declared that Randall's behavior would be dealt with by the headmaster. Randall spent the rest of the day in the headmaster's office in silence. Luckily, the clown did not make another appearance. Later, his mother picked him up from school. Randall remained silent the whole way home, while his mother occasionally expressed her disappointment. That day, Randall learned to keep the clown the secret, but he couldn't prevent its return. 3 years into the school, one day, Randall's class took a field trip along with 4 other classes from the school. On the bus, Randall had the unfortunate luck to sit behind Chad Desmond, the bully of the high school. At one point, Chad singled out Randall as his victim, and that's when it all started. The bully taunted Randall, threatened him, and insisted that he was being watched. Despite Chad's relentless provocations, Randall maintained his silence and attempted to ignore him. Finally, as Chad turned away, the clown reappeared. The clown taunted, highlighting Randall's clear distaste for Chad. Randall whispered for the clown to cease, but the clown persisted, insinuating that they would have more fun than Randall had ever imagined. Amid laughter, the clown lunged at Chad and exclaimed that they should contort him like a pretzel. In a moment of panic, Randall let out a scream and launched himself at the clown. He seized him, forcefully throwing him to the floor of the bus, and tightened his grip around the clown's throat. Over and over, he mercilessly slammed the clown's head against the bus floor, shouting, "Leave me alone." The bus monitor, alarmed by the commotion, urgently instructed Randall to release Chad. Frozen with shock, Randall suddenly realized that it wasn't the clown he had attacked, but Chad himself. Chad's complexion had paled, his lips were tinged with a bluish hue, and blood seeped from beneath his head. Overwhelmed with remorse, Randall loosened his grip and crumpled into the bus monitor's embrace. He was escorted off the bus and guided into a staff car that was waiting nearby. Shortly after, an ambulance arrived to provide medical attention to Chad. Back in the headmaster's office, Randall was confronted by the headmaster and a police officer. The headmaster inquired about the appropriate course of action, while the police officer observed silently. The headmaster informed Randall that a man named Mr. Andrews would soon arrive to discuss the incident. Mr. Andrews entered the headmaster's office. The headmaster greeted him while the policeman maintained his gaze on Randall. Mr. Andrews, a tall man with receding hair, donning wire-rimmed glasses and a business suit, requested a few minutes alone with the boy. Once alone with Mr. Andrews, tears streamed down Randall's face. Mr. Andrews recognized the recent altercations Randall had been caught up in and suggested that Randall had emerged victorious in the last one. Tears continued to flow as Randall responded, denying that he had fought Chad and insisting that it was the clown he had been fighting. Mr. Andrews, briefly removing his glasses to clean them, wore a grim smile for a moment. He asked Randall to describe the appearance of the clown, but received no response. Tears continued to stream down Randall's face. Mr. Andrews then questioned if the clown bore any resemblance to Randall himself. Overwhelmed by emotion, Randall cried, fully aware that Mr. Andrews wouldn't believe him and that nobody else would either. Mr. Andrews stood up abruptly and began to exit the room. Just at that moment, the clown reappeared. With a loud cry of fun time, the clown seized a chair. Crying out in awe, Randall witnessed the clown swing the chair at Mr. Andrews' back. After he fell to the floor, the clown continued to smash the chair into the body of Mr. Andrews. Over and over again. The clown disappeared as the principal and the police office both rushed back to the room. They found Mr. Andrews prone on the floor, his back and legs twisted into unnatural positions. Mr. Andrews tried to yell out, but the only sound he could make was a breathy gurgling sound. Randall was seated with his head on the table, crying uncontrollably. Randall never made it home again. He spent the rest of his school days bouncing between foster families and juvenile detention centers. A few years ago, Randall Jensen sat in a small room at the courthouse. A guard stood posted outside. Randall had just celebrated his 21st birthday. Unfortunately, he had just been found guilty of manslaughter. The victim happened to be his best friend. All the time he waited, the clown sat facing him. That seriously silly grin frozen in place and those piercing unblinking eyes. Randall couldn't comprehend why this dreadful clown was targeting him. Why wouldn't the clown just leave him alone? Randall pleaded with the clown to choose someone else to engage in his horrifying games. But the clown stared at Randall for over a minute before answering. He told Randall that he would only spend 5 years in prison, after which they would have endless fun together, until death parted them. The clown's lips curled up in a terrifying smile that sent shivers down Randall's spine. In that eerie smile, Randall saw an abyss waiting for him with no escape in sight. You may be wondering why I've been looking so exhausted lately, as if I've had a long bout of insomnia. Why I start every time the kitchen cupboard door opens by itself. And why, despite being in my 30s, I have gray hairs on my temples. Well, listen to this scary story. You will probably burst out laughing in disbelief, just like many people I've tried to share my fear with. Until a few months ago, I would have liked to join you myself. Sitting in the well-lit kitchen one evening, a glass of cognac in my hand, I shyly and insincerely echoed the mocking laughter of my friends. Now I don't know whether to cry or laugh. Every morning when I look in the mirror, I see the growing number of gray hairs that have accumulated during the recent nightmare. For some time now, I've been afraid to sleep. Or rather, I'm afraid of waking up in the middle of the night, startled by the faint creaking of a door and a muffled voice calling my name from the dusty depths of a wardrobe. It all started about 2 years ago. We were on the verge of completing another major project. As usual, we missed the deadline and had to leave the office just before midnight. I was exhausted, so I only had enough energy to drink a bottle of beer and go to bed before the evening news was over. I never complained about sleep, especially at times like this. That night, I woke up suddenly. My eyes stayed closed, and for a while, I couldn't figure out what had woken me up. Then I felt that someone was in the room. I know what you're going to say. All the psychiatrists I've consulted have told me the same thing. Many people experienced similar sensations from time to time. They feel as if they can sense someone's intense gaze behind them, and so on. If it had all ended with that feeling, I would have gladly agreed with you. But then I heard footsteps. After standing near the wardrobe for a few seconds, this thing moved towards the kitchen. Its stride was not cautious. The stranger seemed to feel like the owner and made no effort to conceal its presence. I want to convey that the sounds were quite clear, but I didn't perceive them in the typical way that people do. I sensed the footsteps. I felt them as if the sounds bypassed my ears and directly entered my brain. Witnesses who described the experience of telepathic communication state that the voice of the person they were talking to echoed directly in their head. In the same way, I perceived the presence of this being. The footsteps seemed to be born in my brain, and at the same time I could clearly imagine the place from which they came. In the same way, I felt rather than heard the click of the switch in the kitchen. There was no fear at that moment. That came later, when the creature's visits became more persistent and regular. The first time, there were only a few faint knocks from the kitchen, as if someone had moved the dishes left on the table. Then the switch clicked again and the footsteps returned to the wardrobe. And then, there was a sound that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was the soft squeak of a door opening in the silence of the night. I lay there for a few minutes, waiting for it to go on, but all was quiet. Finally, after reassuring myself that it was all a dream, I calmed down. In the morning, the incident seemed insignificant and ridiculous. I had practically forgotten it, and it was only 2 months later that I remembered it. I came home late from a party, a little tipsy, took off my clothes and fell into bed. As you may have guessed, I woke up long before dawn, which was quite surprising in my condition. I could hear the faint murmur of water coming from the tap through the closed bathroom door. I didn't pay much attention at first. The alcohol was doing its job, pulling me into a dream filled with fragments of dreams. Sleep was about to embrace me again when I heard a soft splash, as if someone was washing their hands. I listened, holding my breath. The splash repeated, and then the murmur stopped. I could feel it turning on the tap, though of course I couldn't hear him. It was a strange feeling. Then the door opened. Damn it! I could have sworn on anything that I could make out a faint light through my tightly shut eyelids. A switch flicked, and at that moment, for the first time, fear rumbled in the back of my heart. I heard another sound. It was a very faint sound, at the limit of what I could hear, but it was unmistakable. The thing about the light switch by the bathroom was that every time it clicked, a broken spring rattled, and I could swear I'd heard the bloody spring rattling. It was only a few steps from the bathroom door to the entrance of the bedroom. And as the creature took those steps, it came to a halt on the threshold. I failed to mention earlier that the sound of the footsteps was quite unusual. It didn't resemble typical human footsteps. Instead, they had a slapping quality, as if the creature were wearing flippers, although the sound was not particularly loud, just a faint slap. I am certain that a person walking barefoot would not produce such a sound. So, after stopping at the entrance to the bedroom, it stood there motionless for a while. I could almost feel its gaze fixed on me. Then, after a few lingering seconds, the creature continued its movement towards the wardrobe. The door creaked twice, something inside seemed to twist, and then there was silence. Thank God I was sober, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to sleep until morning. However, being drunk, I started snoring within seconds, completely unaware of my fear. After that incident, I finally got up the courage to tell my friends what had happened. I mentioned it in passing, half jokingly, at a party. My friends just laughed at my scary story. Giving in to the mood of those around me, I laughed too, but the next night it was all repeated, and in a worse form. This time the monstrous creature went to the toilet. It sounds funny, but believe me, I was in no mood for amusement. First there was an incomprehensible muttering from the depths of the wardrobe. It was mostly indistinct, but it gave the impression of a terrible prayer in an incomprehensible, surreal language. The squeak of the door sent a shiver down my spine and gave me goosebumps. And again the soft slap sound. The bathroom door opened and closed. After a few seconds of silence, without the sound of running water or the squeak of the toilet seat, the creature walked into the kitchen. It stood there, again in complete silence, and then returned to the bedroom. As on its previous visit, it hesitated at the threshold, but suddenly it approached the sofa and stopped right next to me. My heart was beating so loudly I thought it could hear it. But I pretended to be asleep and tried my best to breathe evenly and deeply. There was no sound of the creature breathing, only a kind of noise. A faint hiss and crackle, like a gramophone on the last track of a record. And the smell. The whole room was filled with it. It smelled like a damp corner of an old barn. Decay and mold and something else more subtle, but just as disgusting. I was lying on my right side, when suddenly I felt a terrible sensation as it crawled over me and settled into the empty space. It moved and shifted, like a cat finding a comfortable position, and then became still. Now we were lying just a few centimeters apart. I struggled to pretend to be asleep, and I could feel the creature staring at me relentlessly. Its gaze was cold and meaningless, with fish-like eyes, as if it knew I wasn't asleep and was trying to catch me off guard. The panic attack prevented me from even opening my eyes a little. but I managed to fall asleep very quickly. Since then, the monster has never returned to the wardrobe. Instead, it emerges and wanders around the apartment for a while, sighing and mumbling in its own incomprehensible language before settling down in an empty room. It stares at me, and I know it will keep watching until I fall asleep. Strangely, I am able to fall asleep quite quickly in such circumstances. Sometimes the other half of the sofa is occupied. You know what I mean. On those nights, the creature doesn't show up. Sometimes I'm ready to pick up a dirty, drunken beggar off the street and drag her into bed, just to avoid hearing that creaking sound. And I'm afraid to fold the sofa, even though I don't know what will happen. It will probably stomp around me, sigh, and go back into the wardrobe. But what if it doesn't? You're probably wondering why I can't lock the wardrobe. Oh, believe me, I've tried. The door has a simple lock that can be secured with a small key. One night I did just that, but it didn't give me any peace of mind. Instead, I had this unsettling feeling that things had only got worse. Something inside me said, it's better to open it. Unfortunately, I didn't listen to reason and clenched the key in my fist, as if it were some kind of protective talisman, and fell asleep. I awoke only a few seconds before the monster tried to get out. Still in a drowsy state, I heard it push the door. Then again and again. Immediately after that came a series of thumps from the wardrobe. Any remnants of sleep were instantly shaken from me. Clutching the key tightly in my sweaty palm, I waited anxiously for what would come next. The door was banged several more times, with increasing insistence. It wasn't a knocking, begging to be let in. The blows were heavy and less frequent, as if someone were ramming it with their shoulder, trying to break through the weak barrier. Just when it felt like the next blow would knock the door off its hinges, it suddenly stopped. I thought it had calmed down when suddenly a terrible scream came from the wardrobe. It was a half cry, half roar of despair, a nightmarish plea mixed with rage. It was a wild, boundless rage. At that moment, I was on the verge of letting out a scream and rushing out onto the landing, breaking through the front door. Only the sheer terror that gripped my body like a tight knot held me back. I didn't even have the strength to throw off the blanket. Gritting my teeth and squeezing my eyes shut until my head throbbed, I waited for it to burst out of its flimsy prison and pounce on me. If a single sound had come from the wardrobe, I would have either wet myself or stuttered for the rest of my life. Maybe both at the same time. But it was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there until dawn, clutching in my right hand the talisman that had almost been my undoing. As soon as the room was bright enough, I stumbled into the kitchen and poured myself a full glass of whiskey, which I downed in one gulp. Then, on shaky legs, I made my way to the wardrobe. The key turned in the lock with a click, like the release of a trigger. Astonished at my own audacity, or rather madness, I opened the door. Inside, of course, there was nothing. Nothing frightening or strange. A couple of suits on hangers, an old leather jacket, a couple of small boxes containing various odds and ends, and a burnt-out iron. And on the back of the door was a piece of fabric that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. I spent the next few nights with friends, lying about some planned repairs. But I couldn't rely on the hospitality of others indefinitely. So, expecting the worst, I finally returned. The very first night I got home after trying to lock the wardrobe, the creepy creature touched me. It began, as always, by lingering near the sofa, hovering over me and emitting a low growl. Sometimes I thought I heard familiar sounds in its growl. Occasionally, its muttering becomes more intelligible, and then it seems as if it's trying to say my name. It crawled over me, bulky and heavy, and sat on my chest. At first it lay motionless, then it stretched something cold and long towards me, like a snake. Through the thin blanket it tickled my hand, as if a multitude of large beetles were crawling on it. And then it touched my face. The touch was unbelievably disgusting. It wasn't like someone touching your nose or your cheek or your lips. It was touching my whole face at once, all at once. It felt like dozens of slippery little eyelashes, or like cold, wet snow falling on my face. It's hard to explain why I didn't get rid of the wardrobe. I don't know. I can't. For some reason, the thought of it frightens me more than the nightly visits. At least nothing terrible has happened yet. Not yet. You won't believe this, but I'm really scared. Me, a person who has crossed 2 hot zones and made over 30 parachute jumps. Me, who fell through the ice a few years ago and only survived thanks to a calm mind. I'm scared. I'm afraid every night when I go to bed. I'm afraid of my fear. I'm afraid that this time, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I won't be able to stand the overwhelming feeling of terror, and I'll open my eyes. One evening, as I was sorting out the wardrobe in the hallway, I heard someone say,
"Open the door."
I went to the door. The corridor outside was quiet. I was about to leave, when my hands moved on their own, groping for the door.
"Let me in."
I shuddered, as if I had touched something unpleasant. I jumped away from the door and pressed my hands to my chest. They were trembling. As I took a step back, I felt the apartment fill with an unpleasant odor.
"Open to me, quickly."
I didn't notice as I stepped forward, turned the knob, and pushed the door a few times. The locks were locked? I thought, and it was only after that thought that I realized what I was trying to do. I imagined opening the door and letting in whatever was behind it. I shuddered. I jerked, trying to move away from the door, but my body wouldn't listen.
"Why won't you open the door?"
Someone was whimpering outside the door. It sounded like someone used to growling was trying to cry.
"Don't be afraid. Open up. I am your friend."
My body was not listening to me at all. I removed the chain and opened the top lock. Whatever was behind the door was in a hurry, and it passed on to me. My hands began to pull at the locks and handle, trying to open the door, but it would not budge. I tried to shout for help, but the scream was cut short and turned into a wheeze.
"Let me in. You don't want to be alone, do you?"
At that moment, I felt sick at the thought of how lonely and unwanted I was. I wanted to cry tears of sorrow, but somewhere deep inside there was hope that things could be fixed. All I had to do was open the door.
"Why are you hesitating?"
I flailed about in a panic. I have to let my friend in. I have to do it now or he will leave.
Don't go! I'll just...
I looked round the door. Of course, how could I forget? The last lock could only be opened with the key, and the key was in my room.
I'll be right back.
I repeated, running into the room. The desire to open the door enveloped me. Everything was like a mist. I reached the room by touch and found the key. Then a flash of pain followed, I hit my toes on the toilet door. I had the key in my hand, walking towards the front door. I collapsed, shaking with fear. A few more steps and the door would have been open.
Quickly!
The shaking stopped, and I started to get up. My body stopped responding to me. With the last of my strength, I threw the keys in the toilet and flushed. A wave of despair washed over me. I won't be able to let a guest in. I'll be alone, unwanted, worthless. With that thought, I collapsed on the floor and cried. I cried and slammed my fists against the door and rolled on the floor for hours, and then suddenly it was gone. I sat on the floor and laughed. I was overwhelmed with joy at the thought of being alive. I don't know what came and stood at my door then, but from time to time, it comes back. These days, I feel it coming. I have a clockwork safe at home. I lock myself in the house, put all the keys in the safe, and wait. When I hear the unearthly voice and I am overcome with madness, I crawl on the floor and cry at the thought of not being able to open the door. In the morning, everything will be over. I sought help. I went to witches. I went to church. I moved, but all in vain. It still comes once a month and whispers,
Open the door now.
Hidden deep within the dark and eerie woods, surrounded by twisted trees and overgrown shrubs, there stood an old cabin, abandoned and full of secrets. Its cracked walls and broken windows bore witness to the passage of time, and its wooden door creaked ominously, as if to warn intruders to turn back, whispered among the locals in secretive tones. There were rumors about a melody that carried a curse, as if it held some mysterious power. These tales swirled around the cabin like a ghostly mist. It was said that a musician had once lived there, and he had composed a hauntingly beautiful melody that had summoned a presence from another world. These stories were passed down from one generation to the next, deepening the cabin's reputation for being eerie and strange. Ginny, a young pianist, always curious about the unknown, heard the stories and felt a strong attraction to the charm of the cabin. She couldn't resist the urge to play the mysterious melody on her cherished grand piano, her fingers eager and itching to create the enchanting melody. Despite the warnings she had heard, she bravely embarked on a daring adventure to find the cabin, driven by an unwavering determination to uncover its secrets. As Ginny delved deeper into the dense forest, her senses sharpened and her heart raced with excitement. The gnarled branches seemed to reach out to her like bony fingers, and the rustling leaves whispered in an unsettling harmony, almost as if they were guiding her to the cabin's whereabouts. Every step she took felt like a pact with the unknown, as the forest itself seemed to pulse with an electrifying tension, holding its secrets close, yet tantalizingly close to revelation. Finally, she came to the cabin, a dilapidated building that stood before her like a haunting relic of the past. The atmosphere was heavy with an unearthly presence, and a shiver ran down Ginny's spine. Undaunted, she pushed open the door, which creaked, and the musty smell of decay filled her senses. Upon entering, Ginny's eyes widened in awe as she took in the traces of the musician's existence. Cobwebs, resembling a spectral tapestry, swayed delicately in the breeze against the walls, while moonlight seeped through the cracks in the roof, casting haunting shadows across the room. With trembling fingers, Ginny approached the majestic grand piano in the center of the room, its once gleaming surface now obscured by a layer of dust. Tenderly, she caressed the keys, feeling a rush of exhilaration coursing through her veins. This was the culmination of her anticipation, the very moment she had longed for. Without a moment's hesitation, Ginny positioned herself in front of the piano and began to play. The melody flowed effortlessly from her fingertips, harmonizing with the eerie atmosphere of the cabin. The notes swirled through the air, weaving a haunting symphony that seemed to echo not only within the cabin's walls, but out into the world beyond. As Ginny continued to play, she experienced a strange sensation, as if the melody was coming to life. It was as if the music had a mind of its own, pulling her further into its captivating embrace, making it impossible for her to resist its enchantment. Her fingers moved with increasing fervor, entranced by the enchanting melody. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the cabin underwent a chilling transformation. The air grew colder and shadows flickered and swirled on the walls. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. She was not alone. With a quick turn, she scanned her surroundings, only to find emptiness. There was nothing but the desolate cabin, its walls peeling and windows shattered in the eerie silence. An overwhelming sense of anxiety gripped Ginny as she continued to play, the melody morphing into a menacing and sinister tone. What had once been a beautiful composition now emanated a twisted and discordant sound, almost as if it were mocking her. Yet Ginny found herself unable to stop playing. She was trapped, caught in the clutches of a musical enchantment that tightened its grip with every fleeting second. In a startling moment, the piano keys beneath Ginny's fingertips came to life and descended of their own accord. A dissonant symphony of jarring notes erupted, echoing relentlessly within the cabin's walls. Horror gripped Ginny as she realized her loss of control. She was but a helpless spectator, trapped by the power of the cursed melody. It had claimed her as its instrument in this sinister symphony of darkness. The shadows in the cabin seemed to animate, swirling and contorting as if driven by an unseen hand. Ginny's initial delight turned to sheer terror as she realized she had awakened a malevolent presence within the confines of the cabin. Her fingers trembled on the keys, but the melody persisted, growing louder and more turbulent, as if compelling her to play with greater speed, force, and volume. Despite her desperate attempts to resist, the cabin seemed to tighten its grip, its walls seemingly closing in, trapping Ginny in its suffocating grip. The temperature plummeted, and an oppressive heaviness filled the air, making every breath a struggle. Numbness gripped Ginny's fingers, rendering them almost lifeless. Yet the cursed melody persisted, emanating from the piano in a cacophony of dissonant and demonic tones, intensifying the nightmarish ordeal. In a desperate attempt to escape the clutches of the cursed melody, Ginny slammed her hands violently against the keys, desperately trying to stop the haunting music. But the piano resisted her efforts, its keys refusing to release, trapping her hands in their icy grasp. The melody grew fiercer, transforming into a distorted demonic wail that echoed throughout the cabin, seeping into the very depths of Ginny's soul. Ginny's mind became a tempest of terror and confusion. She struggled to let out a cry, but her voice remained trapped inside, stifled by the oppressive forces at play. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with her despair as she realized the devastating truth. She had succumbed to the cabin's trap, much like the musician who had vanished into obscurity many years ago. Now she was doomed to become a permanent part of its ominous legacy, forever trapped in its chilling grasp. As the cursed melody reached its climax, Ginny's vision blurred and her strength ebbed. Collapsing against the piano, her body went limp, her mind shattered. The melody gradually faded into silence, leaving nothing but the weighty silence of the cabin, oppressive and without sound. The next morning, the locals discovered Ginny's lifeless body slumped over the piano, her hands clutching the keys. Her eyes remained wide open, forever imprinting an expression of eternal horror on her face. The cabin once again stood in solemn silence, the cursed melody temporarily silenced as it patiently waited for the next unsuspecting soul to succumb to its spell. Since that fateful day, the legend of the haunted cabin has grown, accompanied by tales of the cursed tune and the tragic demise of Ginny, the pianist. Local warned visitors to stay away from the cabin, telling how faint echoes of the tune could still be heard on moonlit nights. A chilling reminder of the malevolent power emanating from within. The warnings continued, serving as a grim reminder to all who ventured near the cabin of its lingering, menacing presence. And so the cabin stood abandoned, its walls murmuring the haunting tune to any intrepid soul who dared approach, serving as a poignant reminder that some mysteries are best left untouched and some tunes should remain unplayed. The cabin's cursed melody has endured through time, weaving a sinister tale that has sent shivers down the spines of those privy to its eerie harmonies. A chilling legend that has endured through the ages,